So this is episode 5 out of 7 on our van build series, and in this one we're going to be looking at the kitchen. And as our van is only small, we're not able to stand up inside.
And whilst we're absolutely fine sitting down when we're inside the van, it would be nice to be able to stand up whilst we're cooking or prepping food.
But instead of installing a pop-up roof to give us more headroom inside, we thought we could utilise the back doors of the van to make an outdoor kitchen, which would mean we could stand up while we're making our sandwiches.
So the plan for the right hand door is our sink setup. On top we're going to have a water tank which will gravity feed water down to a flip up bowl at the bottom that we can use for our washing up. And on the left hand door we're going to be using the bottom section as a worktop that we can do all our cooking and food prep, and this will also lock into the slide out van vault drawer that's underneath the bed. And we use the space at the top for some extra storage for all our outdoor camping gear.
But before we can start making all of these sections, we need to panel out both parts of each door so that we have something super secure to fix them to.
On the top section of both doors there's this overhanging lip of metal which frames each section where a window would normally be. So we cut some strips of plywood with a small rebate on it which would tuck into that gap, which would give us something really sturdy to screw into. Before we installed these, we added some Sikaflex for extra strength, and we made sure we made all of these strips from 15mm birch plywood, as these would be thick enough to screw into, but flexible enough to match the curve of the van.
We then made a cardboard template of the door panel and then transferred this over to a sheet of 12mm ply. If you want a bit more detail on our templating process, just head on over to episode 2 of this series where we go through the whole thing and give you a proper step-by-step guide.
It's worth noting that both our doors were almost identical in size and shape, so if yours are going to be the same, you can save yourself some time and just template one time for each panel.
The slightly tricky part was to find out a way of transferring the correct drilling locations from the battens onto the front of the panel. Our somewhat genius idea was to knock some small pins into those strips and then remove the heads with a pair of snips to give them a slightly sharper top. We then put the panel back in place and used a mallet to make indents where all those pins were, so we had the right locations to drill through from the back.
Once we removed those pins, we drilled our pilot holes in both the panel and the strips, and then screwed this into place with some countersunk finishing washers to make them look a little bit nicer.
We then had to decide exactly where we wanted our water tank to go, so we held it roughly in place and marked out the hole before cutting this out with our jigsaw.
We left a slight gap at the bottom to allow room for a small shelf which would help support the weight of the water tank. Once we had this cut out, we screwed it into place, as well as some additional strips which helped to frame out the whole section and add some extra support.
So while this was becoming super functional, it was fairly dull and a bit plain looking. So we grabbed a bunch of these old coffee sacks made from hessian, which we'd used to cover each panel to give it a bit of character.
First we trimmed off the seams of the coffee sacks so that it could be fully opened up. Then we popped the panel onto the material and trimmed it to size, leaving a few inches of excess all around. Then we flipped it over, spray glued both surfaces and held it in place. Lastly, we folded it over the edges and staple gunned on the back every few inches to secure it down.
As this panel had the cut-out hole for the water tank, we also cut this back before gluing it in place. Before we screwed this panel back up, we popped some of our 10mm insulation that we had left over from our flooring to use on the right hand side. Then on the left we added a bit more hessian, so when the water tank was removed you wouldn't see any of the grubby old metalwork. To stop the water tank falling out, we went back and added a fairly chunky Velcro strap to the back of the panel, which stops the tank from going anywhere when we're driving around.
For the bottom panel, we tried a slightly different method of templating, where we taped some paper over the whole area and then used a pencil rubbing technique to trace the shape. This actually worked really well, so we transferred it over to a piece of cardboard to double check the fit, and then we cut it out of plywood for the real thing.
As the bottom panels were going to be a little bit more load bearing than the tops, we went back to 15mm ply for these. And as these would protrude a little bit further than the 12mm, we added a little round over using our router.
Where the curve of the van was slightly more dramatic here, the thicker piece of plywood wouldn't bend enough to match that shape. So we cut out a small filler piece which we glued to the back of the panel to fill the gap.
Once this was covered in hessian, we attached it to the door. As we didn't have the same metal lip on the bottom of the doors as we did the top, we simply screwed it directly into the metalwork.
We use these self-drilling screws, which are great for sheet metal, as the screw itself drills the hole with the tip of the screw. You just have to be careful that the metal you're screwing into isn't the outside face of your van, as you don't want screws sticking out the back of your doors.
We're using a collapsible sink, as this means it can be folded away nice and flat, but then popped out when we're actually using it. To attach this to the door, the sink itself needed to sit within a frame, which of course we templated using good old cardboard, which would then be attached to some of these folding shelf brackets. Once we transferred and cut the frame out of plywood, we applied a couple of layers of the clear matte lacquer to prevent it from any water damage.
The brackets were super easy to install, so once that was all sorted, we got the whole thing screwed into place. And once that was done, the tap and sink part of our kitchen was pretty much finished.
One thing we thought would be a nice addition was to add a small piece of hose to the tap using some terry clips. This would prevent it from dripping when it wasn't in use, and also when it was being used it wouldn't splash quite so much. We're also going to be adding a small backsplash, most likely out of recycled plastic, but we're going to wait until the end of the van build once we've decided on a proper colour scheme for the whole thing.
Moving on to the left-hand door, we cut the panels in exactly the same way. We just made sure to cut a small relief in the bottom panel so we could still access the door handle. We then came up with a folding worktop design, much like our folding tabletop we made in the previous video in this series.
When folded in half, it would be small enough to tuck away into our van vault, but then it could be taken out and sat on top of the drawer as well as locked into that door to make a nice sturdy worktop.
To match all of the other surfaces and tabletops in the van, we used 2 pieces of 18mm birch ply for this folding worktop. We then mounted these in our super drawers with a small spacer between the two and routed out the space required for the hinges. Like before, these are 45mm concealed cabinet hinges and are able to open up to a full 180 degrees.
Once they are screwed in and working beautifully, we popped the worktop back in place and marked either side of the sliding drawer on the underside of the ply. We then cut 2 slots about a third of the way through the plywood using our track saw, which meant that the work surface would lock into place and be prevented from sliding around. Next, we had to sort the locking mechanism for the door side of the worktop. For this, we made a cleat that the worktop could slide into pretty snugly.
Once this was screwed to the door panel, we drilled some holes down through the cleat and the worktop while it was all held in place. This allowed us to drop a couple of pins in which would lock the whole thing together in place. We used a couple of Allen keys as our pins as we have a drawer full of them and they were the ideal shape.
We can now store all of our kitchen bits that we need for cooking inside the van vault and have really easy access to them. We are planning on adding some dividers within the van vault so that everything has its own place and is super organised, but we are going to wait until the end of the build before we do that to make sure we have everything we need first. Then lastly, we wanted to move on to the top part of this door for a bit of extra storage. After looking around online for a little bit of inspiration, we decided to repurpose this old leather satchel.
We put a piece of plywood in the rear pocket to use as a backing plate that we could screw through. We then took what was the shoulder strap for the bag and reused it as a strap to hold a rolled up blanket in place to give it that adventure vibe. We then screwed it into place on the door, and this is now perfect for anything like mallets and axes and other stuff we might need outside when we're camping.
So there you go, that is our outdoor kitchen area fully fitted and ready to go. It was really nice to try and come up with some original solutions that would fit our exact needs as well as suit our van. These could of course be completely adapted to suit what you're after, so hopefully there's a few bits in there that you find useful. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Triton YouTube channel and check out the rest of this van build series.
We're doing a full van tour over on our channel once the build is complete, so head on over to Brothers Make and subscribe so you don't miss it.
As always, it was lovely to have you.
Catch you on the next one.